Good morning, everyone. I'm Claude Barfield, a resident scholar here at the American Enterprise Institute, and I'd like to welcome you to our event this morning, U.S. Trade Policy and the Presidential Election. We have two excellent speakers, representatives of different points of view, but let me say from the beginning that neither of the speakers is a surrogate for the campaign, and we purposely chose them for that reason. That is, they do not officially represent the campaign. They understand and know, I think, what the campaigns are saying. Will defend or not defend all the things the campaigns are saying, but they do not speak for the campaigns, so we'll have a little more freedom. One of the things that I can predict, even without having heard the two speakers, is that they will raise the level of the debate about trade policy in the presidential election, because it has been abysmally low to date. On Mr. Romney's side, the only thing we really know is that on the first day he's in office, he will declare China a currency manipulator, a futile and actually foolish gesture, which he would then also, given the economic logic of what he assumes, have to go ahead and name Japan, Korea, Vietnam, several countries in Europe, Brazil, and last but not least, the U.S. Federal Reserve. on Mr. Obama's side,
he'd probably be happy to do that.
Yes, I'm sure he probably would, actually. Just another thing to put against poor Bernanke. On Mr. Obama's side, all we really know again is that he accuses Mr. Romney of being the outsourcer in chief, neglecting to let us know that his pride and joy, the one really ongoing potential trade achievement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, will result in some of the greatest outsourcing and insourcing and out-investment and in-investment, in other words, economic activity that we've seen in over a decade since the end of the Uruguay round. So that we really, it's time, I think, to get beyond that. Our two speakers, I can say, having looked over their material, will range far and wide, though for those of you who are part of the trade mafia here and who need to, to read closely the pages of Inside U.S. Trade, there will be plenty of time for specifics about Article 1, Section 3 of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, at some point, though we will start in the general and go to more to the specific. Let me introduce briefly the two speakers. You've got the material up is on the web, so I'm just going to just a couple of things in each case. Jared Bernstein, as most of you probably know, is now a senior fellow at the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. Previous to this, he was a chief counsel and chief economist and economic advisor to Vice President Biden, and before that, he had spent a number of years. He's done a number of things. It's spent a number of years at the Economic Policy Institute here in Washington. Grant Aldonas is now the principal managing director of Split Rock International, which is a trade and investment consulting firm. Previously in the government, he had been under President Bush, under Secretary of Commerce, and before that he had served as a senior trade counselor in the Senate Finance Committee. There are other things that both of them have done, but I think that gets us started. A lot of other things that they've done, but that gets us started. The format will be, I'll have each speaker is going to open with comments. I'll then ask them to go back and forth and things they might comment on what the other has said, and then we'll turn to the audience. Jerry? Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with Claude and Grant, and I very much look forward to hearing Grant's comments, so I'm going to try to get out of the way pretty quickly. I did notice that there are a lot of young people here today, and I think that's great. It's a great topic for folks to be interested in early on in their career in this business. I will say that given that Grant and I probably will disagree about a lot of stuff and folks may not have their views completely formed yet, it's always better to listen to the guy with the tie on at the end of the day. So if you can't decide which way to go, I'd keep that in mind.
This is very, very corporate perspective.
Yeah, that's right. You got to wear the outfit if I can't,
That's where the liberal left is gone.
Yeah. Yeah. I figure if I've disguised myself. I called my presentation here, Anatomy of an Editorial, because just the day before yesterday, I believe it was, there was an editorial in the Washington Post all about these issues, particularly China trade in the campaign. Much of what Claude went through in the introduction, some of the positions by the candidates, and I found a lot while I agree with much of what Claude said in his introduction, I found a lot of substantive disagreements I had in the context of the editorial. A lot of things I disagreed with, just about facts and some of the dynamics of trade and jobs and wages and prices that I find most interesting and compelling, and I think quite important to the way not only we debate trade in presidential elections, but the way we decide on trade policy. I think one of the key themes of my presentation, in fact, is that if we don't acknowledge not just the benefits of free trade, of which I'm a big advocate, or I should say more trade, because I'm not sure what even, if anybody says free trade, I really don't know what they mean. But the benefits of globalization and more trade are very clear to me. The costs are very clear as well, and I think if we don't acknowledge both of them, inject them into the debate, in fact, if we only talk about them a few weeks before presidential elections, it's to our detriment. I don't mean to, sort of a caveat here, I definitely don't mean to just pick on the WAPO editorial page, and if people read my blog, jaredbernsteinblog.com, there's lots of cases where I use their editorials as examples of very good and compelling arguments, so let me just be clear about that. And by the way, speaking of my blog, I will put these slides up there later if anybody wants to see them or have them or ask me about any of the underlying data. Okay, let's see if I can do this. Claude mentioned my association with the Economic Policy Institute for many years. They just came out with their latest edition of SWA, that's State of Working America, just a few days ago. And there's a very extensive section in there on the impact of trade on wages. And I'd like to start there just to set the stage, to talk a little bit about the idea of the costs of increased globalization, particularly with less developed countries, and that, of course, enters China into the mix very early on here. And again, to fail to recognize these costs is to fail to understand, I think, the nature of the debate, and to misunderstand a debate is to really hamstring your ability to negotiate better policies at the end of the day. EPI makes 6 points in their most recent State of Working America. I actually think they made 7, but one of them just seemed kind of redundant, so I made them 6. These are imports, impact on domestic manufacturing jobs, imbalanced trade, in particular, has a cost on jobs and prices, typically through the product price mechanism. This is a very standard result from trade theory. Export industries, our industries that tend to export, are quite clearly less labor intensive than the import competing industries. So even balanced trade, even under balanced trade, because of the differentials in labor capital, because of the differences in labor capital, would lose manufacturing jobs. Export platforms for intermediate goods, and there's been more and more development, again, particularly in the LDCs, for intermediate goods, have hurt production workers. And again, these are quite clear in the data. The price-wage channel, kind of at the heart of Stolper-Samuelson wage theory, has led to a real wage decline, even in the face of trade-induced lower inflation. So that's a key point. When someone says, well, wait a second, you're pointing out that manufacturing jobs and wages have been hurt by trade, particularly increase in trade with the LDCs. What about lower prices, which is very much a benefit of trade? Well, it's very easy to remember that these wage results are adjusted for inflation. And in fact, one of my points is that the trade debate should never forget that people are not just consumers. They're also workers. Threat effects are another channel by which jobs, and particularly wages, are impacted by trade. That is, There is it's hard to quantify, but there are lots of examples of factories threatening to move unless workers take concessions or don't form unions or whatever. Investment flows abroad have been, as I think I show later, have grown much more quickly in recent years, and it's not a zero-sum game, but it's associated with less investment here in many cases. And of course, as displaced workers from one sector, from a manufacturing sector, move over to the non-tradable goods sector, you have supply effects which also drive which also can have wage effects. And then offshoring, which was mentioned, is not just a silly campaign thing. And I take Claude's point that nobody's agenda precludes offshoring. It is, I think, a pretty well-documented phenomenon. Alan Blinder, a former vice chair of the Fed, Alan Kruger, I think pretty scholarly economists have made that case. If you want to quantify, this is all kind of prelude to getting into this editorial. If you want to quantify the impact of trade on in this case, wage inequality, looking at the gap between college and non-college wages, let's just look at the final bar over that period of 30-plus year period from 79 to 2011, you see a 22 log point growth in the college non-college wage gap, with trade explaining about a third of it, about 7 percentage points. And this is work of Josh Bibbins in the New State of Working America. He's able to pull out a China effect, which is much more significant over the last decade, if you sort of look at the breakdown of the years there. And this is something that other work has validated as well. I'm thinking of the very, I think, highly regarded paper by David Autor and Gordon Hanson and a third author whose name I'm not remembering, and I apologize to him or her. So all of these dynamics I've just described, particularly vis-a-vis costs on the jobs and wage side, have led to the evolution of what I'd call the DC trade consensus. When I first came to this town decades ago, I would say the dominant sentiment was just free trade overall, free trade, absolutely, nothing wrong with it, got to just keep doing it. Both sides agree, more, freer, trade. The 1980s came along, and we actually, for the first time in decades, started to see considerably larger trade deficits. In '79, imports and exports were pretty much comparable. Trade had been roughly balanced as a share of GDP. And the number of jobs created, again, this is using EPI's data from SWA, the number of jobs created by exports and lost to imports were actually about equal, which is kind of what you'd expect given balanced trade. Although, as I said, there are different propensities for capital and labor, with our export industries being more capital intensive and our import competing industries being more labor intensive. Ergo, even balanced trade can affect the composition of jobs. Translating these numbers into, well, at any rate, in the interest of time, let me just point out that by 1989, the trade imbalance had grown to something in the range of 2-3% to GDP, and we had significant impacts in terms of lost manufacturing jobs. Deindustrialization books began to show up. I think it was Bluestone and Harrison, The Great U-Turn, a very influential book. And interestingly, by the way, and this is probably underappreciated, manufacturing employment didn't fall in those years. U.S. manufacturing employment was pretty constant over the 80s, but of course it fell as a share of total employment. Wage inequality began to take off in those years. Wage losses, pressure on unions. So there began to be a significant debate on trade, which kind of reached a bit of I don't know, you say a high point or a low point with the NAFTA fight. And again, I'm not going to go into every part here, but I would argue that the trade consensus has shifted, and a lot of this has to do with something Cass Sunstein called the other day he wasn't writing about trade, but he was writing about how we how debates change. And in the New York Times, in an op-ed, and he talked about the way people change their minds about things is often through what he called surprising validators. And this just kind of resonated with me. A lot of people started saying, you know what, trade actually has some costs as well as benefits. Globalization comes right out of Stolper-Samuelson again, where the factor that is less endowed tends to be whacked relative to the more endowed factor in your trading partner, and they have a lot more sort of low-wage, non-college educated workers than we do. And so right out of the theory comes the results that I've been documenting so far. Paul Samuelson himself wrote an influential article saying, yeah, this can happen. Paul Krugman kind of shifted. People probably think of Paul Krugman as just being an out-and-out liberal on all issues, but no, he used to be quite critical of the EPI view on trade and jobs and wages, but he turned. I mentioned an article by Order, Gordon Hanson, very mainstream economists. And then, we have Republicans and Democrats alike, and not just in the election, talking about issues like China in ways that Claude mentioned. I'd argue that the consensus is actually in tatters, and if I may cast a little bit of blame here, I'm sure both sides own some. It took so long for the free traders to admit that what trade theory has been clear about from the start, and for ignoring that people aren't just consumers. The idea that you can argue with displaced manufacturing workers that, no, wait a second, go to Walmart, look at the prices, get over it, man, is just, I think, quite, it's quite destructive to having a decent discussion about this. Okay. It starts out, it is an iron law of U.S. politics. You can't go wrong bashing China. This is what Claude said, and it's true. Polls show the public believes this country is losing jobs due to unfair economic competition from abroad, especially from China. Well, if you want to disparage something in Washington, you say polls say. That's true. It's true that we've lost jobs due to what I would argue is unfair competition, and thankfully it's not just me. It's pretty mainstream people making that argument as well, as I'll show in a second, particularly by managing currency values and exchange rates. Every 4 years, presidential candidates fall all over themselves, promising to get tough on imports. But how? That's the question, and I have my final slide is about that. I'm very interested in hearing Claude's views on that because I think he has, I think he thinks deeply and clearly about such things. Continued. The crassness is mitigated. So this is all crass, right? It's crass I guess it is crass to bash other countries, but it's, in my view, it's not at all crass to be very worried, concerned, to turn to policymakers for help, for solutions, for a rational discussion about the issues but this is all dismissed, in my view, in this editorial as crass. And the particular crassness is the Obama administration announcement the other day to go after China's subsidization of auto part exports. So this crass is mitigated only somewhat by the fact that the president was responding to Romney's ads, promising to do more than Mr. Obama has to punish China for manipulating the value of the currency, or cheating, as the ads describe it. Well, sorry, I'm not doing my slides here. So much to keep track of. Joe Gagnon has written, I think, influentially on the issue of currency management. He is, I think, a very scholarly guy, works at the Institute for International Economics, and writes that currency management, and it's not just China. I thought Claude's point was extremely well taken. If you're going to, I hadn't quite thought of it that way, but you're definitely right. I mean, if you're going to name a currency manipulator and you want to have any kind of rational standard, it's not going to be just China. Most important development of the past decade in international financial markets is currency manipulation. Governments are distorting capital flows by around $1.5 trillion per year. Millions more Americans and Europeans would be employed if other countries did not manipulate their currencies. Now, I don't know if that's cheating, but it's certainly not free trade. And if you look at Joe's measures of some external accounts, and these again are developing economies, so that would include China. What you see is post-2000, and it's 2001 that China joined the WTO, that the official financial flows of these countries and their current account balance, and you can just see the very clear correlation there. I'm happy to say more about what that means in our comments, but I hope it's clear. This is a picture of pretty massive financial imbalances. And you can see it in the financial flows, and you can, they're net flows, so it's outflows and inflows netted out. And you can see it in the current account balance. The trade deficit with China and the U.S. was around $300 billion, I think, in the most recent data. To the extent that imports from China or Mexico, which sell almost 3 times as much as the United States, reduce the cost of auto manufacturing. Remember, this editorial was motivated by the Obama administration's going after subsidized auto exports, and hence the price of cars. They may help create more American jobs than they cost. Again, it's just not the case. I mean, Rob Scott at the Economic Policy Institute, using very standard input-output stuff, has documented the cumulative loss of jobs. So this is cumulative, adding 1 year to the next. So it doesn't mean 2.7 million in 2011 jobs lost due to growing trade deficits with China. It's saying relative to 2001, that's the number of jobs lost, almost all of them in manufacturing, and that's just purely a function of an increased trade imbalance with China. There's no, I don't think based on trade theory, I don't think based on relative capital labor intensivity, I don't think based on trade flows, I don't think based on the kind of numbers you see here from Joe Gagnon, that the Post's dismissal of this as they may help create more American jobs than they cost is at all defensible. Again, I'm emphasizing the cost side. There are clear benefits, and I myself am a clear beneficiary. I was just very jealously ogling Grant's Apple laptop a minute ago. So, I'm not immune to the benefit side of the equation, but I view my job here as partly to try to add balance on the cost side. Okay, here the Post makes a good point. Is the Mr. Obama who charges China with subsidizing its industry the same president who takes credit for bailing out General Motors and Chrysler? That's a fair point. Of course, the difference is, and I'd be interested in my colleagues' view on this, the difference is the difference between rescuing an industry that's facing liquidation in a 100-year flood where credit markets were closed, and I was on the autos task force when I worked at the White House, and we really did try to seek private financing to take the place of public, and it just wasn't there. So it's a difference between rescuing an industry and subsidizing exports and grabbing foreign market share. That's the Obama's case. So I think I can make a difference there, but I think the Post makes a good point. All right, just winding down here. And kind of moving into the policies that Claude wanted us to reference. So litigation at the WTO. So this is if you're what do you do about the currency management? I always call it management versus manipulation. That's partly because I'm more sympathetic to China than I think many critics on this point. Litigation at the WTO will take months. Would Mr. Romney's idea to brand China a currency manipulator with sanctions to follow get faster results? Well, nothing's going to take months. When I read Mr. Romney's 59 points, the only one that resonated with me was, in fact, the China currency point. And I share some of Claude's reservations. I really do. But I do think that if there's this thing called labeling someone a currency manipulator and they're manipulating their currency, it's not clear to me why you either should get rid of the rule or label them. The reason the reason the White House gives for not doing so is it would muck up the negotiations. Now, I've not sat at the negotiating table, and trade war. But people always raise the threat of trade war. If you do that, I've not sat at the negotiating, so I can't maybe Grant has. I can't authoritatively say that that's wrong. I think it's wrong. In fact, my experience has been in dealing with China. What little bit I've done, but certainly what I've observed from the data, is that they're quite elastic to threats and to actions like this. And in fact, when their currency does appreciate, it tends to be after these kinds of sanctions and deals. The fact is that China has plenty of ways to retaliate on this country when this country protects specific industries. Even if China does not retaliate, the higher production costs and higher consumer prices that trade protection imposes are not evenly distributed. I think I've tried to explain that, yes, in fact, the costs of expanded trade, particularly with the LDCs and particularly with China, falls largely on the non-college educated, middle and lower wage workers. Protectionist measures may save jobs for higher paid workers at the expense of those who make less. Well, first of all, that's backwards based on what I've shown you so far. I really would like to know why advocating for currency values to be set in free markets is protectionist. It's the opposite. To manage your currency is protectionist. Now, there may be a reason to do that. You may have a good reason to do that, just like we had a good reason, in my view, to bail out and to pretty massively intervene in both financial and certainly auto markets. But that's not free trade. That's protectionism. Okay, so what should we do? I actually am a big fan of the currency bill that has gotten bipartisan support. I think it got 68 votes in the Senate when it was up for grabs. It got wide support in the previous Congress. This is I don't know what it's called these days. I associate it with Levin or Sherrod Brown. And this is essentially a bill that says if a country is found to be a currency manipulator vis-a-vis certain products, so it's very piecemeal. We have negotiations can begin that can end with countervailing duties, and while people make this into a big bugaboo, it's really not. In fact, if anything, it can be criticized as piecemeal and pretty small potatoes, because again, it is piece by piece, it is product by product. So I like that bill, and I noticed Sherrod Brown just the other day said if this got to the president's desk, I think he would sign it. But it's that doesn't, I'm not saying either way that he would like to sign it. I'm just saying I think he would sign it. I mean, that's what Sherrod Brown said. He's probably right. But it is languishing in Congress, who refuses to bring it up for a vote, and I think that's wrong. Other solutions, Gagnon, Hofbauer, and others talk about capital controls. That is, this is again to push back against currency management. Tax purchases of dollar asset purchases by manipulators. So if you're a manipulator, and Gagnon has I think a pretty straightforward way to define and identify them, and you're buying dollar assets, we're essentially going to tax that because it has the negative externalities that I've been describing. Dan Gross says, well, if there's no reciprocity, that is, if you can buy dollars but we can't buy yuan because you tightly control your capital, then you can't buy dollars anymore. No reciprocity, no sale. We can go into these more deeply if you like. As we've said, Romney wants to label currency manipulator. I shouldn't say manipulators, because Claude may be right. He has said he wants to label one particular currency manipulator. And then I would argue that the Obama's administration's process has been quite piecemeal in terms of subsidies, currencies, non-tariff barriers, and that's we've seen it in steel, we've seen it in tires, we're now seeing it in auto parts. I would argue that the currency bill is completely consistent with that piecemeal approach. It just gives the administration an easier path to begin a process that would end with CVDs, countervailing duties against illegal subsidies. And please don't tell me that this is WTO non-compliant. You don't know if it's WTO non-compliant, and I don't know either. And no one will know until it goes to the WTO, which it should. I agree with the Post in that regard. And finally, FTA, free trade agreements, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I come from a set of think tanks and economists that have raised very high red flags about free trade agreements and their impact. I actually think both sides really overemphasize the impact of FTAs on certainly outcomes and jobs and wages. I mean, they're there, they matter, but I have a hard time seeing the huge benefits to both countries that are supposed to prevail and the huge cost every time there's a free trade agreement. I think you have to look at them piece by piece, and in fact, I would call an FTA largely a misnomer. If you actually get into the guts of that, I'm one of the few people who, and maybe not in this room, but one of the few people I know actually tried to read the 1,200 pages of the NAFTA, and that's not really a free trade agreement. It doesn't take 1,200 pages to say free trade. It's a set of handshakes on a lot of issues around intellectual property and state arbitration and state-owned enterprises, et cetera. And so this is my issue with the TPP, and I'll close here. I should be on my last slide, by the way. This is my issue with the TPP. I actually think the TPP is worrisome because, to me, it lacks transparency. Negotiations should be transparent. And a multilateral, think of the Doha stuff for people in here who are experienced with this. I mean, this is 3, 4, 5, n-dimensional chess once you start involving all these countries. And the questions of state-owned enterprises, of how you deal with ag subsidies, of investor-state arbitration. This is really a big one in the TPP. This is the idea that foreign investors can enforce minimum investment standards against host states through arbitration procedures. So basically, you're an investor in Malaysia, and you don't like the way a factory you're investing in the United States is regulating pollution. You can. It's not clear that you can't bring a suit under some of the kinds of mechanisms that are evolving under the TPP. So it's a template that is not nearly transparent enough. That is way too. That makes it in many ways way too easy for countries to join in. I think the thing that worries me most about the TPP is once you get it in place, I think a lot of countries can get in under the radar in ways that I fear will be ultimately detrimental. So I'll stop there and turn things over to my colleague, Grant.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Jared, and thank you, Claude. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. Good to see a lot of old friends. The basic thought I want to leave about the future American trade policy is that unless we come to grips with the reality we're in economically, we're not likely to either have a trade debate worth having, nor are we likely to use the tools of trade policy in a way that actually advances us toward a more dynamic economy and more broadly shared prosperity. And although I used to spend an awful lot of time on Capitol Hill, I don't anymore. And when I do, I went up and testified a couple times recently, I was surprised most by the fact that the underlying assumption of the questions I faced reflected a perspective about the global economy and the U.S. economy that's roughly 40 years out of date. And that where we are, what has changed, has not generated a different way of thinking about the conventions of trade policy, the purpose of trade policy, its aims, nor is it integrated into what I think is a broader economic strategy that serves our interest or serves our values. Jared and I were agreeing earlier about, there's two great values that sort of inform the American experiment. One's individual liberty, the other is equality of opportunity. A good starting point for rethinking trade policy going forward is to take the reality we face in the global economy and say, how do we vindicate those values through our actions, whether it's the scope of tax policy, whether it's the scope of our spending, our idea of our complementary programs, and certainly with what we try and do with trade. Now, I'm a free trader. I'm one of those guys that Jared always complains about. And the reason is philosophical. My dad was a refugee from Lithuania. As a young guy, he used to take me for walks along the Mississippi when I was in Minneapolis, and he would start the conversation with one of those phrases like, Grant, don't forget, people will try and persuade you to relinquish your freedom in return for security, and you shouldn't take that deal because you'll end up with both. And of course, at the age of 6, you really have no idea what that means, to be honest with you. You're just looking at your dad going, oh, God, another one of these conversations. Can we just take a walk on the river? But he was right. And in one sense, whether it's through the scope of what we do with that Orwellian named Homeland Security Department, or whether it's the protection we try and provide in the context of trade policy, the idea that somehow you can offer security and that you can exchange freedom for that and that you will have a better outcome is simply wrong. Ultimately, anyone in government dictating the choice of a single mom go into Walmart on Labor Day to buy shoes and jeans for her kids to send them off to school in Winchester, Virginia, which is the Walmart I end up going to, should not have that choice dictated by our trade policy, in my view. And so in one sense, when I think about trade, and particularly when I think in the context of the world we're facing, I actually want to find a way that vindicates the ability of that woman to make the choice that makes the most sense for her children, which is certainly not 100% tariffs on the shoes she has to buy, so it doubles the cost for somebody at the bottom. So it's just picking up on the benefit side of what Jared was describing as some of the costs. The benefits are there very powerfully. They also embrace the value that we want to vindicate in terms of individual freedom. And so I don't want to lose sight of the fact that trade isn't just about the economics. It's also about the choices we make about the society we want to be in. Okay, so enough about preaching. Here's the bottom line. The political reality is trade won't affect the outcome of the election. At best, it can lose you a few votes in Pennsylvania and Ohio, right? And so the idea that we're going to have a debate about the intricacies of trade policy and some of the things that are near and dear to our hearts as trade wonks is unlikely in the extreme. Competitiveness, on the other hand, is always salient. And the issue really is, in this context, what should our policy be to engage in the global economy? Not simply the contours of what we think conventionally about, I'm sorry, I got to borrow that, Jared. Not conventionally what we think about trade policy in terms of tariff subsidies, anti-dumping actions, things of that nature. So part of what I want to do is tease out where we are and then explain why that shapes my thinking about where trade policy should go and how it should be debated in the context of the presidential election. If the goal of an election, much like litigation, is to refine a set of issues to the point where they can usefully be decided, then the debate we'd like to have ought to start with some of these facts. So first and most importantly, think about globalization. What drives it? End of the Cold War. Most of you are probably too young to remember this, but the world was so sharply divided that when I was in the State Department in something called the Office of East-West Trade, and responsible for following the currency accounts and looking at export controls and things like that, the actual interaction between two halves of the global economy was minuscule. We were engaged in barter in terms of the transactions between ourselves and the East. It shouldn't surprise anyone that an enormous amount of capacity was built up on either side of that divide. And with the end of the Cold War, we essentially have to rewrite Keynes's great work, The Economic Consequences of the Peace. In the 1990s, much of what we saw in the steel industry and a variety of others was this amazing amount of supply shifting into the market, driving the cost of manufactured goods down. And that has a lot to do with the consequences of being exposed to the global economy, not much to do with the specific instances of trade policy and liberalization that took place in the 1990s. The second thing is the choice of the developing world. We like to talk oftentimes, and I recall this when I was on the finance committee and we were trying to do with Richard Chris, trying to move normal trade relations for China through the Congress. The constant debate was around whether or not we should allow China into the trading system. And my point was, that is actually not a power we exercise. They chose to join the global trading system. The reality is that most of the developing world opted for markets because of the utter failure of the only alternative model that was extant at the time. The reality is we can shape that by trying to draw them into a set of rules, but it's not that we're going to prevent them from joining the global economy and the impact that, as Jared pointed out, their labor and everything else, and interestingly enough, their economic model is likely to have on the contours of the global economy and the future of both American firms and American workers. Third thing, just an utter revolution in terms of computing, communications, transportation, and logistics. The power of technology, and just to put this in context, in the 1960s, 12% of the value of what we exported represented transportation costs. Today it's a footnote in terms of the cost and the value of American exports. In other words, in those days, while we were debating negotiations that would shift tariffs down by 2% across the board, we had a 12% cost, transaction cost, that inhibited trade far more than the tariffs. And what we're seeing in the reality of the world today is that those transaction costs have dropped radically. far more than could be attributed to anything we've done in the conventions of trade policy. And so I want to come back to that when we think about where we go next in terms of trade policy and what it implies about the rules that we want to try and create. The last thing, of course, was that we did have successive rounds of trade policy. They did succeed, but one of the things I always like to remind us is that the task of eliminating the barriers that went up during the Great Depression in that sort of tit for tat that followed Smoot-Hawley, we're still working on reducing. And the only place we've had any success is actually on industrial goods. If you look at agricultural policy, we actually went backwards for a long share of the history of the GATT and the WTO. It's only with the Uruguay round that we actually introduced any meaningful disciplines, if you call it that, on agricultural subsidies and other distorting practices. Services, which represent 70% to 80% of our economy, lies outside the disciplines of most of the international trade rules. Now, if you set that up, and this is a critical thing to understand, and you put all of our trade agreements on one side, and you put a simple agreement called the United Nations Convention on the International Sale of Goods, which established the international norms of contracts, and you asked yourself which was the more powerful device in expanding trade and investment and liberalizing economic activity, it was the certainty created by the UN Convention, as much as anything we've done on the tariff side, particularly in this broader context of the world coming together, the choice of the developing world to eliminate autarky, move toward the market, and all of that abetted by the shift in technology. You can see the picture I'm developing as one where, yes, the tools that we exercise on trade policy are still important, particularly as it affects our firms and our workers relative to other folks who have an advantage in a market or relative to markets like China where they adopt a set of policies to shift labor in their direction. So our goal has to be certainly to go after many of the things that we conventionally think of as trade policy, and I want to come back to the specifics of what our trade policy should be, but we shouldn't ignore that much of what our competitiveness is now is being driven by other factors, and that much of what we think about in the context of trade policy means reaching beyond the ostensible version of trade policy that really has controlled us for the last 30 years. So in that I agree with Jared. The idea that we're trapped in the notion of negotiating another of the gold-plated free trade agreements and that is the only manner in which we try and grapple with these issues is wrong. And I would say you can't build a political consensus around that. And that unless we widen the debate and grapple with the reality we're confronting, we're not actually likely to succeed in developing a consensus that would allow us to move forward and make progress toward the goals I was outlining earlier. So what are the consequences? Easy. Greater opportunities for trade and specialization, almost regardless of the liberalization. Radical reduction in transaction costs. Why is that important? It's important because what it does is entirely shift the pattern of industrial organization. If you think about, you put this in the context of the tax code. Think about the operating rule. The operating rule in the paradigm is every organization is completely vertically integrated, and the right standard to think about in the context of its operations is an arm's length price between that vertically integrated operation and a buyer somewhere in the world, right? We now live in a world where that doesn't exist. Over 50% of world trade has shifted to intermediate goods. The boundaries of corporations have softened. So I was saying to Jared, the idea that Foxconn is a supplier to Apple and is at arm's length is not part of the Apple enterprise, which is the way we conventionally think about it, both in terms of the legal niceties and in terms of the economics, and certainly in terms of the tax code and the transfer pricing rules. But the reality is Apple dictates everything that goes on the shop floor. The machine tools, the glass, everything that goes into that manufacturing process is designed in Apple. Better to think of the boundaries of Apple having been softened, and we're now living in a world where there's much less vertical integration, and we're going to have to adapt our trade policy and our ideas about trade politics to that reality, not to one where we're still living in the confines of this. You see this actually in the tax code because there's lots of disputes about transfer pricing right now between the companies, multinationals, and the Treasury. One option is to say they're all tax cheats. Now, far be it from me to say people aren't trying to shift income to avoid taxation. That's the reality of the world. But having said that, there comes a point where you see something metastasize, and you have to say to yourself, maybe the model's wrong. Maybe it's not actually the individual rules, but it's the fact that we've got a misperception of how production's organized in a way that would actually affect what we do. So we've also altered the basis of competition in this context. We've gone from something where we conventionally think, and we were all taught in our initial economics courses, it's all about price, right? And price is that powerful signal that distills all information in the marketplace. The reality, the deeper we go into economics, is that most competition these days is over innovation. It's not about price. It's trying to find that first mover advantage that gives you a niche where you can find the alpha, the above normal profits that allow you to succeed and sustain your enterprise over the long haul. It's a powerful incentive to compete on the basis of innovation, and we all benefit from that innovation. We want to continue to foster it, but it's completely a different model than one where we just think in terms of price and Stapler-Samuelson and the niceties of markets that actually converge under the law of one price, which it increasingly does not apply in terms of the way the world economy operates. So as we look at that, we need to be thinking about that reality in terms of the rules we want to create. So beyond that, we've also thought about, we're now looking at altering the basis of competition. We're rewarding, and the returns are higher to those factors of production that allow you to exploit the new opportunities for specialization. And that comes down to capital, talent, and ideas. When you talk with the CEOs of global firms today, they don't spend a lot of time talking about tariffs. Don't spend a lot of time talking about currency manipulation, actually. Spend a lot of time talking about where's the innovation coming from, how do I get access to talent, how do I organize the talent efficiently, and where do the ideas come from. And if I'm looking at it in that world, suddenly I got to say to myself, which I think is the next slide, is we've erased the line between domestic and international economic policy at that point. Suddenly the things you do, the choices you make about tax policy, about immigration policy, about intellectual property are shaping competitiveness much more powerfully than what we think of as the conventions of trade policy, tariffs, subsidies, dumping measures, things of that nature, textile agreements, all that sort of stuff. If we're living in that world, then our trade policy should reflect what that world represents, ultimately. So what that means is rethinking economic policy from the perspective of what incentives does our trade policy create, our tax policy create for individual behavior? How do we reduce the friction in the system, the cost of doing business in the United States? Maybe as important as looking outside the borders in terms of the access to the new market. Investing in our physical and institutional infrastructure. I have to say, Jared, one of the things that I was concerned most about in terms of the General Motors bailout was the implicit violation of contract rules with respect to the bondholders. And the way I think about that is we're eroding the institutional basis and the underpinnings of a market economy. And thankfully, it's one instance, but that's what you start to worry about at that point. It's not the specific instance of the bailout. It's whether we're undermining the certainty that we've built up over a couple of centuries in terms of the enforcement of contracts, property rights, the things that allow trust, which is the most powerful subsidy in our economic system, to actually play out and reduce the cost of doing business. So as I look at this world, and I look in a world that is now measuring time to market and transaction costs as the powerful indicator of whether you're going to be drawn into a global value chain, I'm not thinking about those tariffs and those conventions as much as I'm thinking about how am I going to reduce the friction and make sure that both workers and companies have access to the right inputs and have access to markets. So, what's the role of trade policy? It's a complement to the broader strategy I was talking about. It has a role. And first and most importantly, I do come back to sort of the practical side of lowering the cost and raising the standard of living for every worker. Because Jared's right, every person who's a consumer is also a worker. The equal and opposite true is every worker is a consumer as well. And the truth is that, you know, there's a reason that Franklin Roosevelt is my hero. Because he and Cordell Hunt understood two things about trade policy. One was you were reducing the cost of living and raising the standard of living of individuals at the bottom of the economic period when you liberalize our trade barriers. Equally important, the competition loosened the grip of entrenched interests and the path dependency of the American economy that allowed you to shift toward a different economy coming out of the Roosevelt years. And the irony is that while Roosevelt's vilified oftentimes by people in the Republican Party and people on the right, he's my hero for that reason, because what it does is align the interests of your trade policy with the important thing that economic policy should do, which is serve the broad scope of the American public and vindicate the values I referred to at the beginning. So, what does this mean in terms of lowering the cost of business? But more importantly, when we think about the object of trade policy and what we negotiate going forward, it should not be purely about market access. The reality is that we operate in an economy that is defined by certain rules. Much of what Jared and EPI and a number of folks with that perspective complain about is the fact that the global trading system and the rules don't actually underpin what we would think of as a market economy. It's not a set of rules that vindicates the same sorts of things we see in our own economy. There is no Commerce Clause. There is no Supreme Court. There is no set of rules that guarantee contract sanctity, that ensure that there are institutions. I'm going to take a shot here, Jared, at what this. I'm being what did you call it? An independent validator?
Surprising
a surprising validator. The reality is trade doesn't work in the absence of very good labor institutions. For somebody to respond to the incentive that specialization and the opportunity for specialization creates, they have to see that they are getting something from the gains of productivity they create. And in the absence of good rules, doesn't mean I necessarily buy into what the AFL-CIO says about those rules, but in the absence of rules that ensure that the competition in that market is fair, much more difficult for individuals to respond to the incentives. But what does that mean? It means that the disciplines that we need to be looking for in the context of trade policy really are about how do we create the underpinnings of a global market economy and understand that there's an unacknowledged competition between economic models, state and crony capitalism on the one hand, and what we would like to see as a model of free market capitalism with the right set of complementary policies that encourage the ability of people to rise, right? So that ought to be our goal when we think about trade policy, not simply, as Jared was pointing out, what's the next market and where's the next FTA at the end of the day. So the specifics of trade policy, I'm not sure this alters much of the agenda in a practical way politically. The truth is we do need to go get trade negotiating authority. An artifact of our Constitution is that, we had a revolution over taxes. So we located the taxing power in that body of the people or that body of the government that's closest to the people, the House of Representatives. Every revenue measure has to start there. All our taxes were tariffs, therefore trade policy has to start in the Ways and Means Committee, and then it comes over to the Senate, and then we have to do real politics, as all of us Senate hands like to think about it. But eventually we have to create a consensus that allows us to move forward on some front. The reality of TPA is not only that it's instrumental in terms of the ability of whoever is president to sit down and take a seat at the table to start to move the rules in the direction I was suggesting, but equally important, it's instrumental politically because it's a device for building the consensus that allows us to move forward. It doesn't mean that it'll satisfy either Jared or me in terms of what the negotiating objectives be. I have to say, if you could pass a bill right now, it would probably look a lot like the old ones, which wouldn't come to grips with many of the challenges that we're talking about from very different perspectives. But we do need that vehicle because we have to have that debate. It's what, Richard and I, for example, I remember having a conversation with Senator Wellstone when we were doing China PNTR, and we wanted his 5 amendments on the floor. Why? Because it was better to have them debated and have the opportunity for the members to express themselves so that coming out of it, in one sense, those issues had been decided, at least on this bill. It's the same reason you wanted Jesse Helms to put his amendments in. I know it sort of defies the way most people think about the legislative process, and particularly staffers on the Hill usually think of it as, I have to work everything out so the members never have to meet, right? When in fact, the real goal of being a staffer on the Hill is to make sure that members commit an unnatural act and vote, right? Do something that they could actually be pinned down upon in a future election. That's a hard thing for a politician, but your goal is to put them in that position. And in some respects, that is to make sure that the issues are debated in a way that allows people to take the vote at the end of the day. And so TPA is important as a device to build that political reality. Reinforcing the global trading system, here I'm going to come to what Claude wanted us to comment in terms of Doha. Doha's dead. I've said it since 2003. Maybe I was a little earlier than most people, but the reality is we should stop thinking that was ever a development round. We didn't start bargaining from the perspective of what trade could contribute to development. We started bargaining from the perspective that we've always bargained for, which was looking for, from a very mercantilist perspective, looking for market access so we could offset the political forces in our own economy that were going to resist the liberalization. But what I think we misunderstood is that the nature of opposition to trade, as Jared was pointing out, has changed fundamentally. It's no longer the textile industry or the peanut guys or the cotton guys, right? No, it's organized labor. It's environmental groups. It's a very different model and a very different opposition that you were thinking about. Now the logic of collective action has to apply in a very different way to organize to address those concerns. It's not simply, do I have enough, have I created enough benefits for enough people on the export side to offset the guys who are going to resist any kind of liberalization. That's not what this political debate is about. And so as a consequence, when I think about politics and the future of trade policy, we have to confront the fact that we're not living in this era where conventional mercantilism had created the opposition to any progress on trade or any engagement in the global economy. This is a very different thing and a different set of issues we're going to have to grapple with. Now, within that context, I think it does mean constantly taking disputes to the WTO, and I applaud the folks at USTR, the president and Tim Wray, for making sure that we're taking autos with China to the WTO. And the reason is, however cynical you might think it might be in a political context, which I feel like it's time to replay that scene in Casablanca. Everybody should walk in and say, "I'm shocked that there's trade disputes being sent to the WTO in the middle of a presidential election," right? Obviously, you could be cynical about this, but the reality is this is absolutely necessary step, because until you use the rules effectively, you can't illustrate where they are broken. And in some respects, to understand what we have to negotiate and how we have to elaborate the rules further, you have to constantly be pressing. This is a little bit like civil rights litigation in Thurgood Marshall in the 1950s. It was the constant further elaboration that identified where the gap in the protection of civil rights was. And in one sense, that's what we have to do in the WTO, because the negotiating stuff isn't working right now. But there's a very powerful reason to do that, because it reinforces the value of the underlying rules. And that is the most important part of the trading system, not the liberalization. It's actually the rules and the certainty that they create. FTAs, my own instinct is, of course we should move, but we should move in the way that thinks about them as a laboratory for new rules. Let me give you an idea. I think we live in a world, if you accept what I described about the world we're living, our pursuit now should be of free trade in ideas. And that means we have to think about the rules that underpin innovation. It means thinking both about intellectual property rules and protecting property rights, and also competition policy that ensures that those monopolies can't be abused. And so now we're in a situation where the negotiation has to encompass both sides of that equation to get what we want in terms of a more dynamic global economy and increasingly innovating for people at the bottom of the pyramid, as well as what we should be doing at home to foster the ability to compete in this knowledge-driven global economy. But if you look at the confines of the TPP and also the choices that the Obama administration has pointed out about who's in and who's out, we can't get there from here. I mean, the joke I always make is that I always hear everybody from USTR these days stand up and say, it's a 21st century trade agreement, which of course is literally true. We're in the 21st century. You can't quarrel with the statement, right? It's an honest thing, But if what you meant by that this is a revolution in our thinking about trade policy, it falls so far short of that. The idea that you've grappled with what value chains or supply chains mean in this context doesn't even begin to come to grips with it, much less what I was saying where we should be going if we're thinking about a more dynamic, more innovative economy. Last point I want to make, opening markets that matter. I used to kid Zellick that, which you'll appreciate, Jared, I used to kid Zellick that, now that we're done with CAFTA and Jordan and Morocco, we'd move on to the outer asteroid belt. That would be just as, convenient and as much of an impact in terms of the commercial value. But to appreciate what I'm saying is that if trade is a part of, trade policy should be a part of restructuring our economy so that we are more competitive and we do deliver a more broadly shared prosperity, the irony is, and Mac Dessler would appreciate this because it's about the politics of trade. The reality is that if what we're going to do is create and enjoy the opportunities of globalization, what it actually means we have to do in this context is not be thinking about the conventional trade arrangement so much as we need to be thinking about who do we bargain with that actually can ask for the changes that we need to make. And it's the old Japanese gaiatsu thing, right? We definitely have rules that we have to alter, so we shift the incentives in ways that do help us achieve our goals. But that requires very large trading partners to ask us for it, just as we have to be at the table with very large trading partners to ask them to do what will be politically uncomfortable for them. So when I talk with my friends from New Zealand, I don't know if anybody's in the audience, and they say, you have to understand, dairy is completely important to us, and, it's critical that you move on this. And I say, you're absolutely right. The dairy compact does not make a lot of sense economically. Politically, it seems to have worked, and I need somebody larger than New Zealand to ask for that one. You know what I mean? And so the idea that you leave Japan on the sidelines in this context, or that you discount the value of bringing bigger players into the game, strikes me as odd and inconsistent with where we have to go, even in terms of what I want to see as the changes in our own economy. That's not one. Second thing is, think about where we are in terms of the TPP. The reality is, unless we add more to this game, the political debate as it's going to be framed is going to be about Vietnam, and it's going to be about the concerns that Jared has raised. I'm not sure that that's an agreement that can pass the U.S. Congress, given the state of the trade debate, and as Jared had pointed out, the extent to which the trade consensus has been shattered. And so ultimately, I think to get where we want to go, we're actually going to have to both expand the coverage of the TPP as well as the folks involved. Complementary economic policies, I'll stop here, Claude, yeah. Bottom line is, I wrote a book a couple of years ago about globalization of the American worker, and as usual, I'm going to say something odd and out of the box, but if I could think of one complementary policy that would help our trade policy, it's expanding Head Start programs. One of the things that I realized as I was doing the research is that so much of where you go in life, we all know this, but it's baked in the cake before you actually get into grade school, right? And so if I'm thinking about a society where I can expect people from the bottom to continue to rise over the course of their lifetime, raise their earning power, build their human capital, all that kind of stuff, I want to make sure that kid has a cup of milk and the parents know how to take care of him. Yeah. So I'm a big advocate of that set of policies that would actually encourage the ability of people to come through the public education system and make sure that they have the opportunity to succeed. What I don't think is interventions in the form of trade policy are very effective at accomplishing that objective. There is actually a suite of complementary policies that we have to be thinking about. I'll say one at a minimum and then I'll close. We live in a world where if you decided that candle making is your future, and you decide to take a course out at the Northern Virginia Community College on candle making, that's deductible under the tax code. If you think you might have a future elsewhere and that candle making may not be the future of American industry, you can't deduct that on your taxes, right? The irony is that while we talk a lot about trade policy, many of the barriers that impede progress at a very human level to develop the capacity to continue to learn and continue to adjust in an environment of accelerating economic change lie in other sets of policies. And unless we come to grips with those, and I'm sure Jared would agree with me, unless we come to grips with those, we're going to have a very hard time actually building a consensus on how we engage in the global economy. Because people aren't stupid. They understand the cost of education is rising faster than the cost of healthcare. And trying to make sure that that's available to the next generation of Americans actually is a more powerful shaper of whether we'll succeed in the global economy than the conventions of trade policy as we think about it. Sorry, thanks.
Jared, do you
I just want to
minutes and then we'll
very briefly respond because we want to engage the audience and you've heard a lot from us. So much interesting stuff there. I was trying to compress my comments into just a few. But let me just, there's a lot I agree with, and I very much, two pieces I very much liked, particularly where Grant ended. I thought that there were two things he said that I found were kind of mentally expanding in a debate that's become constrictingly narrow. One was where he ended, the idea that, imagine a president standing up, well, I guess I've heard this. I mean, I must say I've heard it more from the president and the other side. Maybe it's because I listen more closely to him. But the idea that international competitiveness or trade policy, and Grant highlighted competitiveness as under that rubric correctly, is really a matter of investing in your future workforce, for example. And I think that's exactly right. You mentioned Head Start, and I can think of a ton of other kind of equality not equality of outcome, but equality of opportunity enhancers. And I will say, Grant, and I think your side has to struggle with this, those kinds of investments are completely antithetical to the kind of budget, for example, that Paul Ryan in the House has passed, and that massively cuts. 60% of his spending cuts come from the very kinds of programs that are these mobility enhancers that involve Head Start, that involve training, that involve investments in education. So, I think that is a great idea, and I think it's orthogonal to where the Republican Party is right now. The other very liberating thing, and then you kind of gave this and I thought you kind of took it away.
Imagine that.
The very liberating thing was this idea that of widening the debate. The idea that if we have to go through another massive argument with all sides completely enraged about an FTA with Malta or something that's going to be supposedly the beginning and the end of the economy as we know it, it's just a distraction and not useful. And I thought you very kind of inspirationally argued that's not the way to go. That more divisive FTA debates are much too constricted. But then at the end, you kind of said, and so I sort of think we're going to just have to keep debating these FTAs. So I'd like to hear you, figure that out. Then a couple of things I must say I disagreed with, not in your sort of global 30,000 feet up, but just in my experience on the ground. First of all, while transaction costs have come down, one of the things I hear, and it's just anecdotal, so feel free to dismiss it, but one of the things I hear is that actually transportation costs, particularly given energy, and some other costs having to do with production, language differences, certainly wage appreciation in industrialized China, are actually making the trade deal a little bit less clear to some of our manufacturers who argue, at least when you see them on television, somebody puts a mic in front of them, so maybe this isn't the right sample, say, no, it looked to me like I needed to inshore, that there was actually good reasons based on costs to consider inshoring jobs that I formerly outshored. So I'm not sure that the cost equation is quite as simple as you put. Secondly, now this is when I worked at the White House, so you said when you talk to employers or producers, they don't complain about tariffs or currency or intellectual property. Wow, yes, they complained to me about it, and I can't believe I was the only one. I mean, I remember a guy calling me, I won't say who it was, but this was a guy who made a product I was well aware of, in fact, I own some of it, who was telling me about how it was being ripped off in China and replicated, intellectual property stuff. The currency, I hear tons about that from employers. Non-tariff barriers, I hear it all the time. So I just want to say my experience doesn't really back that up. And then finally, and then I'm going to stop. Look, I just thought this is a very narrow. This is less about trade than just I can't let this go unaddressed, which is this idea that somehow by canceling by canceling contracts with bondholders in the auto rescue, I get that is a serious thing. That's not a trivial thing. It's not like equity markets. It's not like your stock share going to zero. You made a bet, you lost. In this case, you signed a contract. I get that, but it was bankruptcy. And in bankruptcy, that happens. If the kind of uncertainty that you worried, and we were very careful, I think, at the White House to protect bondholders in this regard. And I think if the dynamic that you worried about were in place, we simply wouldn't see the kinds of yields that we've seen on bonds, corporate and otherwise, ever since, which have been very low. And I think that, while I understand your concern, I think that was a 100-year flood. It was a bankruptcy event. These things happen. And I think that in this case, that made sense.
Grant, you can have minutes, and I'm also going to assert myself. Answer the questions that related directly to trade. Please do not get us into the automobile bailout. We will have another. We had sessions about that here. You've been in sessions.
Yeah, actually,
I've tried to bring this down back to the trade.
Absolutely.
There's some things he said about the trade side that.
The only
2
thing,
minutes.
The only thing I really want to comment on is that companies don't complain about those things. They do, of course they do. In my conversations with people who are making judgments about where they invest, if it's a product that depends a great deal on brand, a great deal on the intellectual property context, they are concerned about the intellectual property rules. Are they concerned in that instance about tariffs and the other conventions of trade policy? No. when you see somebody who is competing against heavily subsidized steel coming out of China, are they right to complain? Absolutely. But the choices they make about employment and about what they do to raise productivity in the context of a plant in North Carolina is not likely to be shaped much by the conventions of trade policy. The competitive force, the subsidies, absolutely stuff we ought to be going after, because that really is the effort to shift labor to another country, right? That's what these policies are designed to do. And we need to understand it and grapple with it as such. Having said that, when they're making their business choices, was really the point I was making, is that they're really looking at competing in the global economy, and much of that is a sideshow relative to the big drivers of how they decide where they're going to invest, things like that, which is more often driven by things like, is there an educated workforce? Is that where the growth is in the market? Is that where taxes are low? Things like that. So things that aren't the conventions of trade policy. And that's all I really meant to say, not that we shouldn't be trying to address those barriers.
I have two questions, and then I'll turn to the audience. And I want to go back to, this is such a rich discussion, I want to go back to, one is for Jared and one for Grant. I want to go back to Jared's first points, very well laid out point of view and set of questions about trade in general. And I want to take this immediately to the political situation. God knows we have seen with the Romney campaign, the Republicans are all over the map on things, on a lot of issues, okay? But on trade, Democrats are also really have been deeply divided. And I think you, in my mind, represented one part of that division. And the interesting thing for me was that having gone from the EPI, then to the White House, and now back as a private economist, you laid out the skepticism of trade, which I think some elements of the Democratic Party thought that the president was going to adopt, and certainly in the campaign before, it looked like he might, but has not been adopted since 2009. And that is, the logic of what you're talking about would be to oppose the TPP for reasons beyond, I'll come back to Grant in a minute, to oppose FTA, in fact, to oppose FTAs. And the Economic Policy Institute, in that sense, is at war, not just with the Republicans, but with the president and his administration and other economists in his administration, I would say. You know, the Larry Summers of the world and others. So I wonder if we could talk a little bit about that.
What's the question?
The question is, where do you...
Because I agree with the way you laid it out.
So then you would go forward saying that the president should not go forward with these. In other words, there is an element, I'm thinking about, the president's going to have to, if Mr. Obama is reelected, he will go forward with
I think I can answer this now. I think I see what you're talking.
How you would oppose that, I assume.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't, and it's a way I just tried to distinguish myself, though I think not explicitly enough.
I didn't mean that with you personally, but there's a stream of thought in the Democratic Party.
I'd rather probably talk about my own stream of thought. It's the one I barely understand versus the Democrat stream of thought on trade, which is a very deep and murky stream. So I tried to explain that, you know, I actually think that and I think this is why I thought Grant's comments on this were very resonant. I think the whole FTA thing, it gets way out of hand. The minute you start talking about FTA, and I view the TPP as just a cereal box of a bunch of FTAs all jammed together, I could probably write you the press releases of all the interest groups on both sides right now for the next 10 years. And I really feel like that doesn't advance, A, it doesn't advance the debate at all, and B, I don't even think it makes all that much difference in global trade. Again, I think what it tends to do is grapple with sort of these class-based inequality sort of issues on investor rights, on intellectual property, on how you're going to handle an agricultural coalition in New Zealand. I mean, this is not really, I think these are important issues, but I don't think they, at the end of the day, matter nearly as much as trade with China, with whom we do not have a unilateral trade agreement and may never. So my first point would be, I don't really, and I think that's kind of how the administration may think of that, in the sense that, at least on the economics, that these FTAs are important to people, important to constituencies on both sides. Some like them, some don't like them. But the economics of it, I think, are understood in much the way I just described. I think the administration has been very friendly to business, and I think multinationals in particular. And I know that's probably controversial, but man, I am really sure that's true. And if you actually look at the numbers, the one sector that's done really well is the corporate sector, and the part of the corporate sector that's done really well is the multinational corporate sector under his first term. So I think they've been quite friendly to business on that regard, and I think that's why the TPP is appealing to them. I think where the kind of democratic the views that I described come together in my costs of trade presentation in terms of the administration is the part of the Democratic Party that views these piecemeal interventions as actually good and important. So, I was glad to hear Grant agreed with the China, with taking the auto parts to the WTO. The thing on tires was a big deal. The thing on steel was a big deal. I think that those kinds of incremental movements are helpful and good. And I think you'd actually be hard-pressed to find a president and treasury secretary who have been tougher, at least in rhetoric, on China currency. So the one thing that I think I would push the administration hard to do, one area where I think they haven't gone nearly far enough, is in the embracing of the currency bill, which I have seen have bipartisan support. And there's very little in this world that gets bipartisan support. And I would like the administration to embrace that.
I have to say that's what I was
That's it. You're off here.
was one of the places where, on the other side of that issue, I applaud bipartisan support. One of the few places that Speaker Boehner and the President have gotten along and now are acting responsibly in my way is holding up the currency bill. And that's the Speaker on the one hand, the President on the other. And I applaud, that's a bipartisan.
Yeah.
I would say, though, I don't want to go on to this, that if you look at the documents, the Council Economic Report of the President under Mr. Obama, the website of the U.S. Trade Representative, they are very different. And beyond FTAs, their view of what trade does and its positive impacts on the economy are very different from the ones if you just look at what was said. And one would not maybe have expected that, but that's the way it turned out. To Grant, you can answer that.
Just a comment. First of all, the irony is that when I look at those websites, trade
it could
policy
be Bush.
Yeah, well, no, I was going to say trade policy in this administration is like Voldemort. It's that which shall not be named. The reality is you never see an administration official, mention the positive aspects of trade. And I would just use this.
True with TPP,
Yeah, but I would just say as an aside, too, I don't want to quite let things pass in terms of what you're saying about the debate. The reality is that there's a very much an alternative and orthodox view about what's going on with wages, which is inconsistent with what Jared and EPI was saying. If you look at Robert Lawrence's work in terms of disaggregating the actual impact of trade on wages, it's very minor. If you look at Katz and Golden at Harvard, and particularly something that has affected my thinking, the race between education and technology and the shift toward premiums for higher skills and what that implies. And if you look at wages, which, interestingly enough, for the bottom 10% have not declined as much. In fact, they've actually stayed steady, while it's the wages of college educated that have faced the greatest downward pressure over the last 15 years. That's inconsistent with the idea that the decline of manufacturing, the export of manufacturing jobs is what's driving that downward pressure on wages. And when I look at that, I got to say, I can think of an awful lot of things in economic policy generally that may be very powerful contributors.
We could have a good debate about that. In the interest of time, we obviously disagree.
That's what I wanted somebody to lay out. This is another whole session.
It'd be a good session.
Trade on wages.
You should get David Order.
There is another. There are two competing among economists on this.
Yep.
But go back to Grant, and then I'll turn to the audience. This is to sort of bring this down from the 30,000 feet level to, okay, you got Obama or a Romney president next year. The implications, at least my impression, the implications of you, and this is true with Jared too, is that, what would you not go forward with trade agreements if you don't like the piecemeal small stuff? That pushes you in the direction of the WTO negotiation. Could they spend the time, the political capital, on Doha? And what would you do now with TPP, since it is so advanced, and it has become a symbol of not only U.S. economic leadership, but our political leadership and the diplomatic and security leadership in Asia? And would you just drop that or say, okay, we're not going to go forward? The other thing is your point about, to be fair to first to Bush and now Obama, this is a different agreement in the sense that you started with a group of nations, and we'll see how this will work out, and you're adding along the way. But you are adding, and with Canada and Mexico, you're getting heft. And I would think that one priority of the next administration, or whoever is president, would be to bring Korea in, so there you really have a tip in the direction of solid heft in terms of an economic architecture. So the other thing, just in terms of what you kept coming back to, whatever its flaws, and maybe they won't be able to get it, I have in my writings also ridiculed a bit the 21st century agreement, but a lot of this stuff is inside the border. They may fail on state-owned enterprises, they may fail on regulatory reform, they may fail on intellectual property, and maybe they should in that case, but these are things that I would think that a global company, a multinational, would be very much interested in. I think they are. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, just to be
And then
clear, distinctions between where trade policy would go under Romney or Obama, the first and most important thing is the willingness of one Romney to actually go after trade negotiating authority and retake a seat at the table. That's essential to our...
President Obama would have to do that too. Go ahead.
He would have to do it. You don't see him advocating that, right? So the idea that early in the next presidential term, a president will go to Congress, ask for that authority, in part to make the statement that we are not going to sit on the sidelines in terms of shaping the global economy in ways that would shape outcomes for our workers and for our firms. I think there's a clear distinction between the two. The other thing on TPP, don't get me wrong, and maybe this is where Jared thought I was taking away what I was giving him. The reality of TPP means, I think, Claude, you need Korea, you need Japan. The architecture you should be trying to create is an alternative to state-owned capitalism that is such a powerful, attractive device to investment that our friends in China, who are part of that Shanghai clique and still open to the possibilities of further reform and further liberalization, have an alternative. I think you keep the pressure on in terms of an awful lot of the things that the Chinese bring to the table that are negative in terms of the trading system, but let's be honest, we're not going to be pushed, they're not going to be pushed. The question is, can we create an incentive that's powerful enough for them to see it in their interest to join a set of rules that looks more like a free market economy? And so my instinct about TPP is actually I do think you have to go farther, both in terms of the scope of who's involved and also reinforcing what you were saying, Claude, about the stuff beyond the border.
But you would
Yeah.
if you were advising Romney, you would expend some political capital on getting this.
On TPP? Oh, absolutely. In fact, what I would expend it on is saying TPP actually ought to be the fulfillment of what we were talking about with Bogor in an APEC context, which is to try and move as rapidly as possible, particularly among the developed countries of the region, toward free trade and provide an accession clause that allowed people to get on the escalator when they were prepared to do it. But our goal should actually be to invite folks to do it. Now, let me just put it in a very concrete context. If you invited Vietnam to create the set of rules that I was describing in terms of the sanctity of contracts, the lack of government involvement in the economy, labor institutions, things like that, they accepted that. I think you would help solve some of your political challenges in the United States, but it'd be a much more powerful symbol to the Intels of the world as they're making their next investment in the fab. The next fab plant, is it going to be in Vietnam or is it going to be in China? And China's failed, by and large, to move economic activity off the coast into the interior. They recognize Vietnam as the new south coast of China. They understand the competitive consequences of that. Vietnam may be the most important part of that deal at the end of the day in terms of trying to create something in the most dynamic part of the world economy that would actually embrace the kinds of foundations that I was talking about.
Well, actually, Vietnam, this whole thing may fail and blow up in our face, but Vietnam has accepted entrance into these negotiations, knowing that's on the table.
Absolutely.
I'll move. I don't want to cut you.
No,
Jared,
just go to the audience.
Please raise your hand for any comments or questions. Identify yourself. We have a mic here, who's right here. So why don't we start on this end and then come across, whoever has the mic. Mac, I can see, and then the guy in the front row. Des in the second row, and then you.
This has been a fascinating and rich discussion, which, thank God, has gone well beyond the election. I want to pick up on Grant was, I think, nice enough, or maybe not, to mention my name, and so I wanted to just pick up on an interesting point he made about the need to mobilize Gaiatsu against the United States so that we can make important changes that really matter. I mean, and you also mentioned Cordell Hull and Franklin Roosevelt, and basically, presumably that was the early enterprise in the sense of using trade negotiations basically to change our economy, but doing it slowly and doing it carefully. It'd be an interesting thought experiment to ask, what things do we want to change in U.S. law and policy that are at least marginally related to trade, and could you possibly have a trade negotiation which would generate this pressure? I don't mean we probably should change our corporate taxation, but I'm not at all sure that other countries are going to pressure us to do that if this involves our improvement of our competitive position. Movement of persons, immigration policy. Certainly the Indians would push for this, among others. But we ran into a little jurisdictional problem with that on one of our FTAs 10 years ago or so. So I think it's very. And when you look at TPP, I mean, it's oversimple, but it seems to me we're trying to make everybody look like us in a lot of ways, as opposed to using this as a way to deal with some, internal problems here that we could be squeezed into changing. So I think it's a great question, and I guess it would be interesting to try to figure out what some of the things we would like to change, loosen up, improve in our own structure and law that trade negotiations could conceivably help us do.
So let me two thoughts. One is about immigration, the movement of people. If I want to attract investment to the Research Triangle in North Carolina, I have to make sure that a firm can attract the best talent to that enterprise from wherever they are around the world. And I have to ensure that Research Triangle, which thankfully it does, has great public schools, so those executives can say, yeah, that's a place where I could see raising my kids. You can see where I'm going with this, Mac, which is to say that, yes, of course, having rules that actually regularize that so that we can assure American firms, as well as other firms that may want to invest in America, that they will have the maximum freedom to organize their human capital in a way that meets their business needs, and that we want to encourage that. I'm happy to see that as a part of negotiations on what I wouldn't describe so much as a trade arrangement, but a much deeper kind of economic relationship with another country, right? Now, the flip side of that, of course, is that you do have to engage in the niceties of jurisdiction, all the sorts of things along that. But to me, I think that's what the TPA process should be for. Part of what you do in the TPA process, you know that problem is coming. And so you better be thinking about how you have a political process that allows you to grapple with those pressures that are going to rise in that context, because we are going to be looking at very different things, including things like competition policy and the limits of IP, as well as what it should do to protect the rules.
So I think that's a great question, and it's one, in a way, that should really be at the heart of a discussion like this. I was thinking as you asked, what things do we want to change, and you mentioned the TPP, and there's been a lot of discussion about that. I was reminded of this other debate I was in the last couple of weeks on the Chicago teacher strike, and one of my views on that, and I had I think a pretty balanced view. I saw both sides of the equation there. Was that we really want our teachers to solve everything, and it's just not going to work that way. There's too much poverty and problems outside of the school. I mean, actually, some of Grant's points got to this in the context of trade. Well, the TPP is not going to solve everything here. I mean, you could have the best TPP you want, and you're still going to have the big problems, I think, that I've talked about, particularly currency management and the global financial imbalances that I think are so damaging. And I didn't really hear enough, I think, about that in the discussion so far. So two things I would want to change would be the Joe Gagnon graph that I showed, where you see the net investment position, particularly developing countries, is way net positive in the 1.5 trillion if you sum it all up, according to his calculation, with large current account imbalances. And I think that has to change. I am a free trader. The Washington Post is wrong to call anyone who objects to currency management as protectionist. It's the managers who are protectionists. Now, they may have good reasons to do so, and we can argue about that, but that's protectionist. So the one thing I would do, I'm an incrementalist. I would talk about, I'm an incrementalist. I would talk about the currency bill. I would talk about the piecemeal stuff the Obama administration's doing. And then the second thing I would do, and this is probably totally unrealistic, I would pretty much punt on this notion of a strong dollar policy. I don't believe we have a strong dollar policy. I believe.
I thought we'd already punted on that.
Yeah. Well, we say, but I would say let's punt on the rhetoric then, because again, I believe currency values should be set in international markets. And in fact, one of the differences between us and the Eurozone right now is our currency can adjust and theirs can't. And that makes a huge difference in an economy in a difficult situation.
I just have to chuckle, since we're talking with Mac and we're mentioning the Washington Consensus. Mac, of course, works at the home of the Washington Consensus, and ironically, going after exchange rates has now become the Washington Consensus.
Good.
That institution is the Washington Consensus. Let's go on. Here, in the front row.
Both very much for your remarks. My name is Todd Fox. I'm with Rio Tinto, and I was formerly a trade bureaucrat in the United States government. And so my question goes to the bureaucracy. And one of the interesting things about this discussion, and particularly of Mr. Aldonas' remarks, is the idea that we need to rethink and do some really serious, deep dive into what is making the global economy work and what's driving competitiveness. I served as a career person in both the Bush and the Obama Commerce departments, and I've never seen any shortage of big ideas of how the global economy works. What I've had a very difficult time seeing is how that translates into the bureaucracy, which I'm not sure if it's was designed 40 years ago. Maybe it's more like 30 years ago. But I'm not sure what it takes for labor, where Dr. Bernstein worked, or commerce to really update their own internal machinery to deal with the world economy as it really is.
I'll turn to Jared in a minute, but this is AEI, and so it won't surprise you to say that much of what the Commerce Department does should be abolished, certainly in terms of trade policy.
Simple resolution to the problem. So just to be clear, I don't work for labor. I don't work for labor. The think tank I work for doesn't take any contributions from labor. And in fact, I'd like to believe that my comments have been actually quite balanced between capital and labor, but you can decide for yourself. I think the answer is leadership. I think that it's a great question, by the way, and it's very important, because if the big thoughts don't have a way to drill down to the bureaucrats, you won't get anywhere. So I think what happens, I've seen it myself, when you come into office, you can have big ideas, and then your phone starts ringing, and it's this constituency and that constituency, and that becomes your life's work. So you're asking a question that's very big, and I think the only way it's going to change is if you have leaders who are willing to say, I'm sorry, constituent, even though you contributed $1 gazillion to our campaign, I'm not going to do what you want. And that is very hard for politicians or secretaries of commerce to say. Maybe the answer is, maybe this is yet another line of discussion that takes you to the corruption of money in politics.
I guess my first thought was, that number one, the substance of what you're trying to achieve should always drive the architecture that you create in government. And that means focusing on the big ideas first, unfortunately. Example, the president's idea about reorganizing trade bureaucracy, a solution in search of a problem, right? And that is a waste of political capital at a time when we have much larger issues that we have to tackle. And of course, the irony of actually having managed a part of the Commerce Department is that, as was always the case even when I was a young guy in the Foreign Service, the reality is, as Jared points out, your people are your policy. And with good leadership, you got an awful lot of talented people in government. Admittedly, there's some people who open the door and peek out to see if work is going to sneak in before they head for the men's room, that kind of thing. All right, it happens. It happens in corporate America a lot more than people like to say. But having said that, you know what you have to do is you have to say, I'm going to run as hard as I can, and the people who are really good and inspired by the ideas are going to run and keep up. Because it's just like, people in Washington, you all represent the top 2%. If you're inspired, trust me, the talent will be there at the problem. But I think that's a way of saying, let's do the substance first, let's reach agreement on what their goals are, and that ought to drive reorganization of what we do in government. Because, for example, my world, I'd like to get rid of the Department of Education, Department of Labor, have a Department of Human Capital. I would like to have us thinking in terms of what those policies do to vindicate the idea of equality of opportunity. And I would say that given the path dependence of the Education Department, the Labor Department right now, that's not what they do, right? They serve constituencies just like the Commerce Department does. So to me, it's really that's focus. And then the leadership point, I think, is critical because there's lots of great people, but you got to have a path that they are, going to follow and contribute to. In terms of, because no one mind is going to be able to get these ideas out there. It's going to take all that talent.
Milton Grenfell, American citizen. The Hamiltonian system of tariffs enabled us to go from an in-debt agricultural republic to the world's leading manufacturing nation and the world's greatest creditor nation by World War II. We abandoned that system, and now we are the world's largest debtor nation, and our largest export item is scraps. Okay. We're essentially the trade profile of a third world country. So the real scraps and next is soybeans or something. I mean, these are not high value added items.
But that's not literally true.
It is true. I've seen it. Well, anyway, drive around America. We're not making much. Look in a hardware store. Something. Look. Well, anyway. Okay. The question is, what about the idea of a value added tax at the borders? It's basically a tariff that will enable us to remake our economy?
Well, I got to say, the first thing is when I was in the Commerce Department, I did this 22-city tour of America, had roundtables with manufacturers across the country. And the first and most important thing is that Lou Dobbs is wrong, right? All of our manufacturing didn't close yesterday. The truth is that the overall value of American manufacturing relative to the world economy has stayed relatively constant, while the world economy has grown by 30%. And so when you think about that in the context, and you see a guy manufacturing baking pans in Ohio and selling them globally because he's found a way to find the customers as well as integrate himself into McDonald's, global supply chain, things like that, and you see somebody who's making submersible pumps, can't make a more hardcore manufacturing item, and has found a way to be just outside the reach of then Mayor Daley in Chicago and close enough to O'Hare that he's got the best transportation link in the world. He's found a way to succeed. What I was inspired by was that was in spite of many of the things we do in terms of government policy that hampers that kind of innovation and hampers the ability of our manufacturing class. The thing that I'm always concerned about when we want to do things that would help our manufacturing sector is it ignores what I was saying about the disaggregated nature of industrial production within our country. And my point in saying that is that when I talk with manufacturers, I was very surprised thinking that what I would hear from them was the need to give them special benefits, a leg up, as it were. But there was this interesting thing where most of them knew that if you shifted the tax burden to their suppliers of services, they would end up paying anyway. And so that ultimately, they weren't so interested in that so much as they're saying, how do we lower the cost of doing business generally? And then, oh, by the way, and maybe this goes to your point, and certainly Jared's point, how do we make sure that if we have to find our way into global markets and new markets, that the competition there isn't going to be burdened by another government set of policies that distort that because they want the labor and they want the jobs?
I think the world of Alexander Hamilton is probably not a good template for today's world. And I thought, Grant's comments about technology and its impact on globalization are true. And if you just try to squeeze the balloon in the way you're suggesting, I think it'll probably cause more harm than good. So what I would suggest is instead of worrying about erecting tariffs here, let's break down tariffs there, and including non-tariff barriers. And they're big. I started looking into this when I was in the White House. I mean, I remember, and by the way, I meant to say this earlier. I actually thought, this White House signed a lot of free trade agreements. And the Korean Free Trade Agreement, for one, which was not an easy thing to get over the hill. I remember learning about the non-tariff barriers, the way they changed a rule at one point on where the license plate goes on the bumper, so that all of a sudden our car, we would send cars down there with a little hole for the license plate in the middle, and they say, oh no, the license plate has to go a little bit this side. That's a non-tariff barrier, and there's tons of that. That's what we should be breaking down. But I also agree with, I think, what was just discussed here, that I do think we should help our manufacturers, what I just described, and particularly my comments around pushing back on currency management, would help them a ton. It's probably the best thing we could do for them. The other thing we could and should do is to provide credit, and this is very much a plank of the Obama administration, is to provide them credit in new areas of research and development, which is, by the way, it's in the manufacturing where 70% of our R&D takes place. Provide them some backstopped investment and credit in new areas where the market will underprovide. That tends to be in areas of clean energy, and if you go back to the very beginning of America, this is an age-old pattern. I mean, whether it's railroads, transistors, the GPS, the internet, nanotech, geothermal, now solar and wind, these markets just don't evolve without some support from the government sector.
I'm coming to here and then back there.
Hello. This was a very interesting talk. Thanks for that. After going into, so for me as an international student, it's more into details. I want to come back on a more general question. First of all, my name's Matthias Witt. I am a student in the Washington semester of an American university, as well as a student of the University of Münster in Germany. And my question is on an issue that both of our speakers, Mr. Aldonas and Mr. Bernstein, addressed, and it's basically on you talked about tariffs one of you talked about that tariffs are not that interesting, more the issues of innovation and human capital management, and on the other hand, Mr. Bernstein said, okay, it actually is an issue, and I think personally, it of course is an issue of economic, an economic issue that is important to companies, because you always want to improve profit, but on the long term, Mr. Aldonas' approach, I think is more interesting, and I wanted to hear your comment about. I guess my guess is that since innovation and also the human capital management are more issues that are individual to each company, and it's not like a global variable that the whole system has to apply to. Like,
Can we get to the question?
yeah, the question is your comment about. So I think the thing is that every company has to pay tariffs, and therefore it is not so interesting for competition. Okay, you can argue it on global versus regional markets, but I mean in general for multinational companies, versus the idea of implementing rules, and that's where you were trying to get to, the rules on intellectual property and.
So let me try and take it a little further. I get what you're saying about the fact that a tariff could apply to everybody, and therefore it may not be interesting, whereas the choices you make about these other things are idiosyncratic to the company. But the reality is the rules that govern what you can do in terms of bringing talent to the United States, our immigration laws, for example, different countries are exposed to those differently, but they all confront those choices. The same way that different countries, based on how they are organized, are exposed to tariffs differently. Some pay higher, some pay lower, depending on the focus of their business and what they have as inputs and what they do as exports. But the reality is that setting the rules in a way, in both instances, that encourage the ability of our workers and our firms to be exposed to global competition and to participate in the markets that are growing is what ends up being critical. whether you're talking about tariffs or the other stuff. So I just want to be very clear. I wasn't saying we don't focus on tariffs. You got to grapple with that. But there's so much more that you have to do to get to the problems that Jared was talking about, as well as to actually acquiring the benefits of globalization.
Unless you, go ahead. We're running a little sort of time, so I'm going to take maybe 2 or 3 together when we go here, here, and there on this side, and then I'll come over here. I know you guys have been raised your hand a long time ago.
Down on the wrong
This
side.
question, then there's one back there, and then one back there. 3 in a row.
Hi,
Could you
my
be
name's
brief,
Chris.
please?
Yeah, sure. My name's Christopher. I'm from Denmark, also a Washington semester student. My question's for you, Mr. Aldonas. You mentioned that the Doha round was dead, and we've discussed that in class, that there are several reasons why it won't work out, because there are so many interests that need to be taken care of. Then you mentioned that you want to push through it with the TPP and also include countries like, well, several countries. Aren't you afraid that by including more countries, some of the same problems arise as in the WTO with the issue of many interests, and then you can't agree on anything, and then, well, yeah, I think you get my question.
Yep. Okay, the next in the back.
Hi, my name's Alan Beatty and I write for the Financial Times. I had a question about currencies, which is, I'm sure you've seen the estimates, including from Joe Gagnon's colleagues at the Peterson Institute and from the IMF, suggesting that currency undervaluation and misvaluation has reduced very significantly in the last couple of years, along with current account imbalances. And the renminbi appears to have stopped appreciating, but that seems to be because of genuine capital outflows from China, right? Not because of a resumption of official intervention. That being the case, is all this focus on currency not, a solution to yesterday's problem?
Well, I mean,
Wait.
oh,
One
sorry.
more, and then we'll.
Hi, I'm Kyle Victor from the Atlantic Council. I just wanted to ask if you had any thoughts on a potential free trade agreement between the U.S. and the European Union, and how the political coalitions for and against that would break down differently than a trade agreement with a low-wage developing country.
Okay, I'll turn now. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just looking for, here's Joe's latest paper, which is dated July 2012, which is where all the numbers and the citations and the point that millions, more Americans and Europeans would be employed if other countries did not manipulate their currencies. He at some point in here says that he thinks the output gaps in Europe and America are comparable to the a currency imbalance, to the demand that's lost through the currency imbalances. So I think it's very much alive and well. I think it is a good question as to just how much, say, the RMB would appreciate if it were allowed to float. And, I've seen estimates that are 3%, which is kind of where you might be, and estimates that are 30%. And I think the issue is very much alive and well, and I think it's why Joe's paper is so recently dated. It's not just China. In fact, there are a whole list of countries that, and again, I would say manage their currency in order to get an edge in the export trade, and so the issue I believe is very much alive and well, and it is by no means yesterday's battle. And in fact, by the way, if you look at the history of China and you just plot the RMB to the dollar, it goes like this. It's flat, it's a straight line for a bunch of years, and then things wiggle around, and then it's a straight line for another bunch of years. So my historical experience is no, the issue lives on. I'll only say, I'll let Grant deal with TPP being as multidimensional and difficult as Doha. He could figure that one out. I will say I don't really get why you'd need a trade agreement with the Eurozone. I guess I don't see the advantages therein, but maybe I'm missing something.
Just one quick question. I think this is true. I don't have the numbers right in front of me, Alan, but I think since 2005, the Chinese currency against the U.S. currency has been about 30%. And the current Peterson, I don't know about that particular paper, but other things have said it's in a 5 to 10% range now. And the IMF has projected, as I recall, that the current account surplus in China will run in the 4 to 5%. As opposed to the 10 to 12.
Well, that would be very
15.
good for a lot of reasons, not
the other
least
thing
of
we
which
ought
is
to keep
China
in
internal
mind,
investment.
keep in mind is that the currency is important, again, we have the basics here, But the U.S. current account deficit or surplus is much more governed by the fact that we don't save and we invest and consume more than we save. So we're going to have a deficit with somebody if it's not China. Anyway, we can go.
Good point. Alan, just to pick up on whether it's yesterday's problem, the irony is that just when all those forces that you accurately point out are at work and you've seen the appreciation, China takes a look at its largest market of Europe and then starts to manipulate its currency downward to make sure that because it's linked to the dollar, it's not rising against the euro. And so the irony is that overall the management of currencies, and I would include Bernanke's efforts in terms of liberalization, as you and I of QE2, maybe QE3, the rest of the stuff might fall in this category as well at the end of the day. Certainly it's going at the heart of the good faith and full faith and credit of the U.S. government. But my point in saying that is that it still is an issue. Whether it's the most critical issue in our relationship with China, I'm not so sure, because I'm more concerned about the core weakness in the Chinese economy at this stage and the fact that it will cease to be a driver of economic activity, not only globally, but more particularly in a lot of the developing world, which is advanced on the heels of its production. So the irony is that we should move on currency. At the same time, we're going to have to be looking very carefully at what's going on in China, because there's going to be a lot of fallout if their bubble collapses the way ours did.
You had TPP quickly?
Oh, sorry, yeah, TPP.
EU.
Short answer about TPP is that there's a great amount of self-selection going on here if people actually want to liberalize. I have to say, having been in Doha and then having been in Cancun, the number of people who had learned to say no but had not yet learned to say yes in the world trading system, it was impossible to get to yes, right? The value of doing something like TPP and making sure that other large trading partners in the most dynamic region of the world are a part of it is that they're self-selecting themselves because they are prepared to go as far as the TPP would require. I would like the TPP to go farther in terms of elaborating a different set of underpinnings of a market economy in the region. But having said that, I think that helps solve the problem that you rightly point out with the WTO at this stage. Lastly, on US-EU trade, you know, I have to admit that the mercantilist bone in me that used to work at the Commerce Department thinks, you know, you should always buy low and sell high. And right now, you know, it would be good for Europe actually to negotiate with us because of the restructuring that has to go on in the European economy. It'd also be good for us to have them as an interlocutor in terms of trying to iron out what the underpinnings of a global market economy should be. So there's a value to doing that negotiation, and there's a value to doing something that would be largely acceptable and even supported by the AFL-CIO as a way of trying to move the bow of the ship of American trade policy in a positive direction where we would start to elaborate some of the rules that I think make a difference for the global economy.
Okay, we've got two or three more. Is one in the back, and I don't know how many other is here. The other thing to keep in mind, this is really speculation, the next term in the United States and with others, is that if the may not be a real world, but it is a potential ideal world. If the TPP goes forward and looks as if it succeed, and then the United States and Europe turn together, that is a way. You know, Zellick was wrong in terms of competitive liberalization, at least in his time. He was going to build from bilateral to regional to global free trade. But it could be that a decade and a half later, that may be where things are going, because nobody here in either party here, and I don't see it in Europe either, wants to go back right directly to the WTO. But if you go through Asia, and then the U.S. and EU try also, then who is left? So this may not happen. It can all crash and burn, but it is another way that could happen. In the back.
Hi, my name is Richard Chris. I'm a trade lawyer with my own director of my own firm. And I wanted to key off something Grant said earlier about adapting trade policy and politics to the real world. It strikes me that without trade promotion authority, we miss the opportunity to be real influencers at both at the negotiating table and elsewhere in the trade realm, and that we miss in doing that, we miss real win-win situations or solutions that could help bridge the domestic and economic interests that we have. And I wanted to just briefly put out a real-world example of that and maybe get some comments. as you all know, Eastern Africa has had probably the worst drought in 60 years. They're experiencing tremendous economic hardship. And at the same time, a lot of African countries are appreciating the value of adapting new technology in agriculture and the gains in productivity that can help them with. And they're realizing that they really have shared economic and trade interests. And that can help them address the issue of food insecurity. But again, at the same time, without the United States having the credibility, the president having the credibility to put forward potential solutions to this type of environment where the United States could be an active player in providing those solutions, it seems to me that we're really missing out. So I just wanted to make that as a comment and see how we can possibly recreate or create the opportunity for a bipartisan compromise that can
That's
get trade
our
promotion.
last question. I'll go to Grant, and then I have to have a.
Yeah, Richard, I like the question in part because I think it also goes to the heart of how we ought to be negotiating in the future. If what you want to do in an area like agriculture, where you and I both know we've been just blocked, in part because we're still living in a world where we think it's important for us to trade subsidies disciplines with the EU, and that confines a lot of our thinking, particularly as we're doing a farm bill. If, on the other hand, we said, what would we have to do to liberalize the entire agribusiness value chain, step by step, like we did with wool tariffs a long time ago, but step by step so there's benefits as you go through the value chain? Interesting enough, you start to create the opportunity for trade-offs that would make an agreement possible that would end up with liberalization of some of the things that we know are of concern in terms of subsidies, but also new opportunities for our agriculture. And here I'm thinking very much about why we should be using trade policy in the future to grapple with issues like food security. In part because what I think it does, Jared, is it draws in new constituencies and it gets the focus right about why we should be doing liberalization. It should have a point. It shouldn't be pointless, which I think is a lot of what Jared has always criticized, right? You know, the sort of, we're just going to keep generating it. But if you think about food security as an issue of how do I, as I was saying earlier, reduce the friction in the system that allows me to get the right inputs to small and medium-sized holders in East Africa and then pull their products through the value chain to a global consumer market, now suddenly I got a very different way of thinking about how we should go about trade liberalization. So I think that's very much true. And in the absence of making that kind of a piece of how we say we're going to bargain like this in the future, and TPA is the vehicle for doing it, it's hard to see how the president or the ag secretary or the USTR come to the negotiating table and actually do something about food security and use the power of trade to try and find a way to lead the problem.
I have a slightly different view of that, and that is, I think it would be good as a general rule for the president to have trade promotion authority, but I do not think that it can be shown that. Let's take the TPP as an example, that the lack of trade promotion authority in the United States has been a major factor in the negotiations. In other words, nations are putting things on the table. It would be nice to have it, but it is not, theoretically, I think I may have written at some point that, you know, we're going to be trapped if we don't have this because the president doesn't have it and it's good to have him have it. But it hasn't really affected trade. People are assuming that he or whoever the president is will get that. The second thing is, and here Grant and I may disagree, and he's been on the Hill, so I will defer to him. There is an argument that the TPA is going to create, there's going to be a big debate. It could be a corrosive debate. There is an argument that you're better to have, when you come to the Congress, you're better to have something on the table, and that the time for the president, whoever the president is next year, to come to the Congress with or the year after for a TPA is when he has a good deal negotiated about the TPP or some other agreement. That you don't hit the Congress with an abstract authority, but you hit them. This is why I think it is good. This is why we have gained more than we've lost. And I'm willing to defend this treaty and by the agreement. And by the way, I need for TPA to get it through. I don't know whether.
Yeah, well, two thoughts. One is that it's a high-risk game to leave it to the end. And whether or not you get, in a classic game theory sense, the best and final offer of people in the absence of having the ability to conclude and implement the agreement and get an up or down vote, hard to say now, obviously. And, you know, ironically, even after 14 meetings, we're still at a fairly early stage in these negotiations in terms of getting toward that best and final offer. The other thing I would say, though, about TPA and the idea of going after trade promotion authority is I'm very conscious of my own experience, and I want to engage in the fallacy of composition and reason to a general rule. But one thing I would say I learned was that there was a value to those initiatives that actually engage the debate and try and move the bow of the ship into the wind. So one of the reasons we moved the Trade and Development Act in 2000 was simply, even though it was inconsistent with both Roth and Moynihan's constituent interests, and certainly Chuck Grassley's too, the reason was you had to get something movement in order to be able to then make progress on the front that would matter to Chuck Grassley, that would matter to DuPont, that would matter to people in New York. And so, ironically, I think bringing that debate forward, and I think also broadening it, so that what we're talking about are those complementary policies that go along with that, is a part of the thing. And the model for me is actually the 1988 Act, in one sense, Claude, where you had to put an awful lot of things on the table that grappled with a lot of the challenges we face in the trading environment to acquire the authority to actually reach beyond those problems and develop the WTO and the agreements that went along with it. But I think that's probably where we are, and it's a vehicle for building that consensus that I'm looking for. If it's the TPP, hallelujah. I have the feeling, though, that it's going to be people will want to know what they're buying into before they're confronted with that trade agreement and a vote on Vietnam.
Well, before these guys even started, I predicted that they would raise the level of debate, and please joining me in affirming that and giving them a good hand of applause. Thank you. Thank you for coming.